Think we're ready. We're online. Hello, everybody. I'm Piotr Harak, the head of the Polish Economic Institute. Welcome to our part of the internet right now. Everybody who tune in to discuss, I think, also important issues. We began this year, year 2020. Thinking about midterm time schedules, we're thinking about some events that could take us a bit further in the future. This is the 2020, not the 2021, which is going to be next year. So we were thinking 30 years ahead, and we created a project which almost all of our teams, so almost 30 people took part in, to think of risks and also think of challenges ahead of Europe in the next 30 years. And I would say that this is one of the most fruitful discussions we had this year, because at the beginning of the pandemic, we sacked this project. We basically stopped doing it because we didn't see any sense. Then in the middle of the pandemic, we thought, okay, let's redesign it to maybe think of a different way, because there's for sure there are some things happening and some catalysts which the pandemic is a catalyst of some processes that are we can see in our surroundings and in our economic surroundings too, are taking place, and many people are thinking of this time as a beginning of a quite new, different period in economic policy. So this brought us to discussing 7 challenges ahead of the European Union, ahead of Europe in the next 30 years. And here we're going to discuss our paper. I hope it's going to be interesting to everybody. And I have some renowned guests. First, there are 2 female speakers from very known, with great economic backgrounds, and I think it's a pleasure for me to have them online here. It's Galina Vicente, the country director of the European Union, Europe and Central Asia of the World Bank, now in Brussels. And also Beata Jaworczyk, head of the chief economist of the EBRD, one of the most important banks at this time, and also co-authors of one of the most interesting reports about the state intervention during the crisis of 2020. And before that, we're going to see a keynote speech from Michał Kurtyka, the Minister of Climate and Environment, the Polish government, who unfortunately couldn't be today with us online, because he's at OECD actually in Paris, so in person. We thought that he could schedule some 30 minutes or 1 hour during his trip, because of the during the pandemic, all things which are online sometimes happen, but it didn't happen. Nevertheless, he managed to squish some time of his. He's also a candidate for the OECD Secretary General, so good luck in his bid for this post. And I guess it's to Minister Kurtyka right now. So Jacob, please put it online.
First of all, I would like to thank Polish Economic Institute for high quality report. I regret I cannot participate in this event in person. Time horizon presented in the report 2050 may seem distant, especially during the current second wave of pandemics, when we cannot predict what is going to happen in the next few months. However, risks mentioned in the report already start materializing, and COVID-19 pandemics could serve as great accelerator. They are rightly named, and now it is our task to face and tackle them. The document is called Europe 2050, but its geopolitical scope is much broader. Globalization has strengthened links between countries, made them more dependent upon each other. That is why we need to work on rules that would be acceptable for all parties. And the last few years were tough for multilateralism. The mistrust and uncertainty about one another's action in international politics were growing, putting multilateral cooperation in question. Consequences of such attitude were far from satisfactory, both economically and environmentally. One of the greatest lessons that the EU can draw from the COVID-19 crisis is that only acting together, engaging fully, and remaining supportive, we can try to build back better our health system and economies. While acting as COP24 president, I was negotiating framework that finally got accepted by all states involved in the process. If elected Secretary General of the OECD, I pledge to fully stick to countries-led organization principle, as only thanks to it we can deal with world's greatest challenges, well defined in Europe 2050 report. And I would like to refer to three of them. First, increasing the costs of climate neutrality coming from the reduction of investment in new green technologies. This threat is serious. On the other hand, states are now drafting their post-crisis recovery plans, and a number of them intends to invest substantial amounts of money into green investments, ensuring that natural assets can deliver their full economic potential on a sustainable basis. They go even further. Japan and South Korea officially announced climate neutrality targets to be reached within the next few decades. Europe is not alone with its new Green Deal plan. However, we are still missing one key player, United States of America, which I would like to invite again to the climate neutrality table. The second issue worth mentioning is secular stagnation in the developed world. We are not yet able to thoroughly assess all long-term societal and economic consequences of the pandemic. But we do know that mobilizing an unprecedented volume of public and private capital for the development of new resilient infrastructures, scalable technologies, and innovative business models will be needed to get back our economies on the right track to build back better. New technologies aligned with climate goals in economies, energy and environment sectors should be seen as a chance to drive long-term investments. New growth. My agenda as Secretary General candidate is about unleashing the potential of new industries and jobs, while at the same time improving the quality of the environment. And last but not least, you mentioned deepening polarization and economic stratification. The very nature of the pandemic means that the exposure of some increase risks for others. Addressing global inequalities is today more than ever the condition sine qua non of world collective well-being. Mobilizing international assistance and providing strained economies with well-targeted support is the only way to build people-centered growth. European Union has recently constructed instruments like Recovery Plan, which could overcome consequences of the current crisis. We need such actions globally, and I count on OECD in this regard. Europe is at the crossroads. The COVID-19 has only highlighted its biggest challenges. In the past, Europe has proved a number of times that we know how to reinvent ourselves. I'm confident that we can achieve this time as well.
Thank you very much. Now I guess it's time for the presentation, and here to present the paper is Paweł Śliwowski, who's the head of the strategy team of the Polish Economic Institute, and then we're going to have a high-level debate on the topics discussed and also discussed here by the Michał Kurtyka, head of the Polish Ministry of Climate. And climate is one of the risks we also see. So not getting there in 2050 with the goals that many countries, not only in Europe now, as he said, are important to go to climate neutrality. Climate neutrality cannot be reached. Paweł, it's now your floor.
Thank you very much. Okay, I hope you all see the slides right now. Thank you, Piotr, for introduction. Today, I have the privilege to present the work of the, as Piotr mentioned, the whole team of Polish Economic Institute. So I take this opportunity to thank all my colleagues from the Polish Economic Institute who worked on this paper. As Piotr already mentioned, we were aiming to write a totally different book, and it was designed as a book and the bigger conference. Then we had to change our plans and to adapt to new reality. So to some extent, we had the exercise of being resilient in writing about Europe resilience. So it was a double task for us. And in several weeks during the pandemic time, we tried to look at what pandemic shows us about different socioeconomic mechanisms that are important for future of Europe, for future of Europe economy and European societies. And we looked at the pandemic as a focusing event. This is a term from political science, from public policy science, in which some of the events which pose serious threats to our existence, they also have the potential to show us deep truth about everyday mechanisms, which we are less likely to observe and less likely to focus on during the normal times, during the times of peace, of calm, and during the times when everything goes according to a plan. So our pandemic, we looked at the European economy, looked at the European societies through the lenses of the pandemic, and we decided to describe 7 main risks for Europe. Some may say that this is a large number, that haven't the pandemic been enough? What should we do if there are another 7 risks on the horizon? But we can say we are still a bit optimistic, because when we look at European Commission and European Parliament discussions and documents about the future of Europe, the list of risks could reach more than 50 items. So focusing just on 7 risks seems reasonable for this time. So during this brief and synthetic presentation, I would go one by one through all of these risks. I will start with the risks related to the global position of the Europe. So the risks related to chaotic deglobalization and international trade. Then I will go through the risks related to the technological race, in which European Union as a whole and European countries separately seems to be lagging behind the rest of the world. Then I will move to internal risks. And the key risks here will be the deepening polarization between the states, as well as the polarization inside the states, the societal economical polarization inside European societies. And we will close this presentation, as already mentioned, by the risks related to climate change and all the issues related to Green New Deal. So let me start with the first risks. and this is a risk related to chaotic deglobalization. For years, we have observed something that was called by the scholars hyperglobalization. We were living in a world of increased trade collaboration, free trade deals were blossoming, but then China joined World Trade Organization and the free trade was expanding. But then we experienced something which was called Chinese shock for some of the world economies. We experienced a global financial crisis, which has serious consequences for the international trade. And then from that point, we started to observe something which is called by some scholars deglobalization or stagflation, so the stagnating growth of international cooperation. And this is something that pandemics also articulated, that when it comes to shrinking resources, when it comes to emergency needs, countries seem to fight to not to cooperate, but to compete for shrinking resources. This is not something entirely new. The historians of global economy, the historians of business, they say that it already happened in the interwar period in the 20th century. So the period of growing protectionism, the period of escalation of tariffs on several goods and commodities, the period in which political leaders speak more about protecting home economy rather than cooperating with external worlds. So pandemic shows us that we are to relive once again the same mechanism that we already experienced in the past. And what is the risks for Europe related to those chaotic deglobalization mechanisms? In our view, Europe was one of the beneficiaries from global free trade. And the pandemic shows, and all these changes show, that in the world in which global rules of free trade are violated, in the world in which more and more tariffs are put on the more and more goods, there is a risk that member states will turn into competitors for the dwindling resources. And in the extreme scenario, when the worst case scenario emerges, member states could fight for dwindling resources, which will in turn lead to violation of free market rules. So in our view, this is the serious risk for both position of EU at the global market, but at the same time a serious threat for the EU common market inside the continent and inside the community. And the last risk related to these mechanisms, to these processes that we are observing right now, is that Europe could lost its superpower of putting the regulations, of generating the standards, for example, in the food markets, the standards or regulatory rules in other markets, and we will not be able to promote, to input our solutions on the global market anymore. So these are the risks related to chaotic deglobalization. The second global risk that we think Europe will be facing is the problem with technological race, with the technological progress, in which Europe seems to be lagging behind. What pandemic showed us is that European societies, European countries are really dependent on external solutions. For example, when it comes to contact tracing applications, remote working, on remote education, majority of solutions that were useful and widespread were not designed and implemented by European companies, but by the companies from outside the Europe. So the threat here is that we still will not be able to catch up in the race, as we can see on this chart here, describing the spending on research and development in relation to GDP. Not only we will not be able to catch up, but we will be starting to losing the ground and the distance between Europe, China, United States, and other Asian countries will grow larger. Now I would like to move to the risks related to internal situation. So, pandemic was once again the crisis which showed that some countries in Europe were hit harder, and this asymmetric shock was felt harder in some part of the continent. This was also visible in 2008-2009 crisis, and then subsequent 2011-2012 crisis. But right now, the first wave and all the economic forecasts related to the loss of the GDP, loss of the economic output, shows that once again, Europe in South will be hit harder, and the problems related to the discussions on EU Next Generation Fund show how this economic polarization fuels the conflict inside the Europe. We have already observed emergence of extremism parties, political parties in the Europe. We have seen the renaissance of Italexit movement in Italy. So this polarization, in our view, is not only threatening for the European economy. In a way, it will be much more difficult to design and implement serious economic policies and respond to the changing economic situation, but it is also to some extent a serious threat for political community. When we speak about the crisis and respond to the crisis, it is worth mentioning that Europe has once again used strong state intervention tools in response to the pandemic crisis. And one of the risks that we identified, and one of the risks that we wanted to underline here, is that the state capitalism, which was idealized as a response to overly deregulated neoliberal economy, have also some pitfalls and bottlenecks ahead of it. So the risks here are that the public debt could increase when the fiscal stimulus packages become a permanent feature of the economic policies around Europe. The central balance sheets could increase to unprecedented level and to remain so as well. And what the risk is here is that still we don't have the clear idea and the robust scientific evidence what are the long-term consequences of such policies. On the other side, that strong interventionism in the market economy could lead to, for example, diminished risk, to increased risk aversion in a part of companies. They could become less likely to invest their own money, and the productivity of the European economy could shrink as well. So we think that although the initial responses to the crisis were fully rational, right now there is the risk what to do to prevent all these things to happen in the future years. The next two problems that we are describing in this report are the problems related to internal divisions inside European societies. The first of the key problems that in our view pandemic accentuated was that we live in the dualized war of labor market and social protection policies. For some, labor market and social policies offer a large protection. They offer a permanent contracts and all the social security nets attached to it. But for the others, who, especially for the young people who entered the labor market in recent years, the level of social protection, the level of social security is much more weaker. At the same time, we are observing the income inequalities growing around Europe, And what pandemic showed us is that this division is extremely visible as far as we look at essential workers. So the people who are safeguarding to some extent our economies during the darkest hour, the people whose work is not teleworkable, the people who don't have the power or possibility to work from home. And at the same, these are the people who earn the least. Those are the people whose economic and social situation is most difficult. And in our view, this is also related to the risks of the emerging future, the risks of too small, too weak pension contributions, and emerging automation and robotization problems which are ahead on the horizon. So one of the risks here, as far as the social policies and labor market policies are related, is to find new solutions for this dual labor market and to deal with this dualization, which historically emerged during the recent decades, but now, in our view, is one of the serious threats for the prosperity of the European societies and for the functioning of the European economy. And the other side of this societal division is the demographic division. In our view, we are observing more and more growing gap in the demographic structure of the society. We are observing serious demographic shift, and more people are growing older. The electorates of the European parties are growing older, and the needs of these electorates are shifting. More and more people in Europe will require social security and healthcare policies. At the same time, the situation of younger Europeans, as far as we look at the housing problems, as far as we look at labor market, as far as we look at other services, for example, services, educational and childcare services for young families, we know that the problems of these young generations are growing, but at the same time, we see that the needs and exigencies of older populations are growing. So in our view, this divergence here is a serious threat for the future of Europe, especially from the political side of view, and is also a serious threat for the demographic future of Europe, because young people living in a precarious world, young people living in a world with shrinking public services responding to their needs, will still be less likely to have families, to have children. So the vicious cycle of demographic problems will only get stronger. And last but not least, we close our report with the risks related to the EU climate policy. As you can see here on the graph, after each of the previous crises, when the global CO2 emissions dropped, they always bounced back. And what we fear right now is that the pandemic and the small but visible drop in the global CO emissions could be then followed by growth once again. In our view, we also see the problems with the increase of waste usage and with the uncertain situation related to critical raw materials. So we think that contrary to already discussed issues and contrary to the policy discussions which are held right now, when the serious economic crisis emerge, some of the countries, some of the economies will decide that investing in green economy, investing in transformation is too costly in comparison to more pressing and more actual needs of the economy, and that the progress towards climate and energy transition goals of the European Union could be stopped or weakened significantly. We also see the risk that to secure the provision of raw materials needed, for example, to produce energy renewable resources, energy renewable infrastructure, we will stand and have to decide whether we still want to achieve our climate change goals in expense of environmental destruction of some European areas. So this is the one of the tragic dilemmas that we could face in the future ahead of us. So these are the 7 main risks that we outlined in the report. I would like now to pass the voice to Piotr and to ask our distinguished panelists to discuss all the issues that we are showing. And I strongly encourage everybody listening right now to read our report, and we are always open to discussion, to questions. We hope that you will find it interesting and thought-provoking. So thank you very much, and I gladly pass my voice to Piotr.
Okay, thank you, Paweł. Okay, we're back online. I also ask everybody who's listening in over the internet to ask questions. If you're watching us through social media, or you're on Zoom with us here, you can ask questions. I'm gonna get them to when we're gonna go to the Q&A phase, and probably ask them to our distinguished guests here. Also, a kind of chance to ask Paweł, who was the coordinator of this paper that we published, and hopefully during the next years, and also we're going to do a follow-up. So we're going to ask some other questions concerning the future of the continent, future of the European Union itself. And I'm going to start with the first question, which is to our World Bank representative, Galina Vincelet. I was during this pandemic, we read the news, we read the new studies, economic studies on the impact of COVID-19 on some labor market, but also some labor markets, but also some societies. We see a big threat of people going into poverty in some of the countries. How do you see, watching the whole continent, the future of the European economy after the pandemic? How did it affect the poor in Europe? Is it in a pretty wrong way, but a reason for you guys at World Bank doing many developmental projects, a reason to think of new kinds of developmental projects for European members, European Union members, or European countries? Galina, the floor is yours.
Very good. Thank you very much, Piotr. And first of all, thank you for inviting me to this really important but also very interesting discussion and debate around the 7 risks that you yourself have outlined in the presentation and in the report. As you pointed, 2020 is a year where the COVID-19 pandemic is a defining effect, right? It's a defining event, if you will. It's leaving deep scars on the economy. It's also hitting the poorest the hardest, but it's also leaving us with a level of uncertainty which has been quite unprecedented. So from a global economy perspective, we see that the pandemic has pushed the economy into the deepest recession in 8 decades. This is the deepest recession since the Second World War. We expect that the global economy will very likely shrink by over 5% this year itself. And you're right, it is leaving major implications for poverty reduction, with poverty rising for the first time in 2 decades, in more than 20 years. So the combination of COVID-19, climate change, but also conflict is estimated to push on a global scale something like 150 million people more into extreme poverty. And you're very right, the crisis has not, unfortunately, spared Europe. And what we see is not only a sharp contraction of output in Europe, but also effect on the poor. And despite the proactive fiscal and monetary response to COVID-19 that has encouraged firms to retain employees, supported household incomes, helped avoid mass closures of otherwise viable firms, we see that despite the fact that we have been able to avoid sustained rises in unemployment, there are declines in incomes. There is also declines in hours worked. So in the summer, we published our regular economic report for the European Union, and this is titled Restarting Resilience. And already there, we reflected that at least 1 in 8 households could very well face income losses this year. And 1 in 5 women are likely to have greater difficulties returning to work compared to 1 in 10 men. So there is also a gender dimension here. Of course, this will impact poverty, and we do anticipate a rise in the share of the population at risk of poverty in Europe, pushing somewhere between 11 and 15 million people in Europe into the risk of poverty this year. And we don't expect that the situation will drastically improve next year because of the drains on household financial resources that we see. But if we take a little bit of a broader perspective on the prospects for growth in the continent, in Europe, we do expect a rebound in 2021. The rebound will be somewhere in the neighborhood of 1 to 3% next year in 2021, but it is surrounded by very large, very significant risks. And that's why this range is so large, right? We usually will come and have a point estimate and say, you know, growth next year will be this big. Well, this time around, it's quite uncertain. And that's why we have this large estimate between 1 and 3%. And here, I think what is very important to emphasize is the risks that we see around this forecast and the risks that are underpinning the forecast. It will largely depend on the duration of the pandemic. It will largely depend on the availability and the distribution of an effective vaccine. We have good news recently, but our countries, our societies going to manage to distribute and to make the vaccine available will be something that we will see. It's a risk that we need to be aware of. Another risk that is worth highlighting is the degree of investor confidence. Restoration of investor confidence will underpin improvements in trade. It will underpin improvements in investment. Without investor confidence, we will not see this restoring of trade and investment confidence. And there is one last risk that I think it's worth highlighting here. It's a longer-term risk. And that is that the pandemic could have really scarring effects on households, on firms, on governments, leading to persistent behavioral changes that lower potential growth. And it's something that, you know, the pandemic has brought about, and it's something that we need to be aware of. Perhaps to close a little bit on this economic prospects and the impact on the poor, I think it's very important to think how Europe, how the world will be able to overcome these risks once the health and the economic crisis caused by the COVID-19 pandemic are brought under control. And here, comprehensive policy efforts will really need to address an underlying trend which we see in productivity growth. And this trend is a very steep fall over the last decade in Europe. And as such, reforms will need to focus on reigniting the long-term growth prospects. And here, perhaps I can give you a couple of groups of efforts that I think would be able to reignite productivity growth and boost potential growth, if you will. And then maybe we can look into those a little bit more deeper into the discussion. But to me, it is absolutely paramount that we strengthen governance institution. We continue to improve the regulatory environment to protect contract as well as property rights, but also the new aspects, if you will, of the recovery, which have to do very much with innovation, with digital development, with investing in climate as well as in people. Those are some of these pillars that can ensure that productivity growth is restarted and that the economy will be put on a more resilient and more stable growth path. So let me stop perhaps here, and I'll be happy to pick up on any of these points. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Galina. Now I wanted to ask Beata Jaworczyk, who before we're going to go also to a paper that the EBRD also published, this is going to be my second question. So first I wanted to talk about international trade. We discussed about this just before the panel, but many European leaders, Emmanuel Macron, also on global leaders as the Prime Minister of India, the Japanese government are introducing some sources of new initiatives for international corporations or their own businesses to go back and produce back in India, or to invest in India, Japanese companies to go back to Japan from China. We see European leaders saying that we need to produce more here in Europe. It doesn't also mean that it's going to be produced in France when the French want to do that, but how do you see this discussion? Is this process feasible? I know that you said in many of your interviews that this process could happen, but when we're in November 2020, did you actually saw any decisions made by any business boards of directors that wanted to, you know, change their headquarters or change their production plan?
Well, thank you, Piotr. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be part of this discussion. So let me put your question into a broader context. Now, in the report, you talk about the risk of chaotic deglobalization. I am actually less pessimistic than you are. I think it is natural that the speed of globalization has slowed down. And that has happened because a lot of the low-hanging fruit has already been reaped. So we've already exploited ability to shift production to low-income destinations. So it's natural that the pace is slowing down. Also, because emerging markets such as China are growing, and they are both producers and consumers, so global GDP is growing, but trade is not keeping pace simply because, you know, they are both producers and consumers. So I wouldn't worry about there being chaotic deglobalization. And I actually think that the COVID pandemic offers an opportunity for more globalization in the area of services. We have been thrown into this giant experiment of working from home, right? That was something that was happening already before, but there was a lot of hesitation. Now that firms have crossed the psychological border of remote work, a lot of them are going to keep that. And that means that if you are a firm in London or a firm, you know, in Hamburg, why do you have to limit yourself to workers located in the United Kingdom or in Germany? Why not hire somebody from Poland or Moldova? So actually, I would expect more export of services happening through remote work. And of course, there are limitations. You know, there's the issue of different time zones. There is the issue of data protection. There are different data protection regimes. And, you know, there are restrictions on travel. Obviously, it's easier to hire remote workers if they are in a close time zone, if they can easily come and visit headquarters or if they are under the same data protection regime. So, I actually think that COVID may give a stimulus to globalization. Now, what I worry about is, will the world sleepwalk into protectionism? So let me elaborate on that. At the moment, every government is helping its firms one way or another. So it is going to be very easy to make an argument that exports that are coming in are subsidized, have benefited from subsidies. And it will be very easy to use exceptions allowed under the WTO rules, such as countervailing duties, to protect against subsidized exports. And once countries start pointing fingers at one another, the situation may escalate. We may have a domino effect. Now, we were worried about growing protectionism after the financial crisis, but what was different back then was that the G20 very early on issued a statement committing the members to free trade, right? We haven't seen such a statement now. So I'm hoping that the change in the US administration will be more interested in expressing commitment to free trade and in rebuilding the WTO. During what limits recovery and what limits growth now, it's uncertainty. And this uncertainty about pandemic is compounded by the uncertainty about the future of global trade, of global trading rules. So anything that can be done to limit uncertainty about the future trading rules by strengthening the World Trade Organization, by working towards resolving the US-China trade conflict is going to help growth. Now, to come back to your question about economic nationalism, right? So some countries such as Japan, Taiwan are offering incentives for domestic firms, for domestic multinationals to bring production back. I don't think this is going to make a huge difference. I don't think we are seeing a lot of reshoring. I don't think we are seeing a lot of production being brought back. And I think there's also a fallacy in that thinking, because if you close a factory in China and you bring it back to a developed country, you are not going to bring the same jobs. You are going to automate this, so you are going to bring very few jobs. So I think governments are going to discover very quickly that these subsidies don't work that well, and if anything, they are not very good at creating employment.
Maybe it's a source of creating Industry 4.0 that also previous European leaders wanted to pursue.
Well, I think, we know that the experience with picking winners with industrial policy over the decades has been quite disappointing, right? So I think if you want to pursue industrial policy, then you need to be very clear about the market failure that you are trying to address. So for instance, there is an argument to be made about subsidizing R&D spending, because we believe that there are externalities associated with that lead to faster growth. There is an argument that can be made about lowering barriers to entry by, for instance, foreign firms, because these firms are often producers of knowledge and their entry is associated with productivity spillovers. There is an argument to be made about state intervention in green transition, because we are talking about public goods, about issues about transnational effects. But I think giving subsidies just for firms to bring production back is unlikely to be very successful and lead to growth.
Thank you very much. And now back, and I urge you to ask some questions if you want. There's a pretty big chance I'm going to ask them, and I see. Okay, there's one on my list, so I'm gonna ask it later on. But I wanted to go back to Galina. Both in our and in your new report, you're addressing the issue of the digital dilemma. We're obviously meeting online. We're in different time zones, not, but maybe in different places. This pandemic made many companies and many people embrace the technological change. Many see this also as a possibility for Europe actually to succeed. Do you see this process of rapid technological adoption in Europe, which, you know, many see this region of the world as being less developed in terms of the technological advancement? Maybe this is some kind of optimistic note for our part of the world to adapt faster, to create new values, and maybe as Beata told us about also succeeding in, for example, services exports within the European Union, for example.
Very good, Piotr. And thank you for putting this this very extremely timely question. We indeed just last week publicly unveiled our latest flagship report, Europe 4.0, addressing the digital dilemma. And perhaps I can tell you a little bit of what we discussed there, which very nicely pivots to the question that you're putting on the table. So. Let me just give you a little bit of the framework, because that will help you pick up some of the nuances about Europe and how the region is performing in this digital arena at the local but also at the global space. So we look at three broad categories of technologies. We have operational technologies, and here think about smart robotics, 3D printing, this type of technologies. Then we look at transactional technologies. These are the platforms. These are the consumer to producer to service provider opportunities. And then we have informational technologies, which is the cloud computing, the data work. And then we say, okay, you know, we have these three types of technologies, but what is their impact on social and economic goals that Europeans care about? And those goals are really in the core of European social and economic thinking. They have to do with rising competitiveness, they have to do with fostering market inclusion, and they have to do also with geographical convergence. So you have the three technologies, you have the three goals, and then what we find is that the European firms are strongest in those technologies where the benefits are most concentrated. And the European firms are relatively weak where the gains can be most widespread. So in some ways we say, well, this is a dilemma that the Europeans will need to address in some ways. So let me just unpack a little bit and give you a little bit of a flavor of what we mean on that. So Europe, what we find is that has been a global and established leader in operational technologies. Again, this is the smart robotics, the 3D printing. But what we see is that these technologies are expensive and they need to operate at a large scale in order to produce productivity gains. So naturally, because of the nature of production, smaller businesses often don't have the financial strength to buy the machines needed to compete in this area. So in some ways, you see that the inclusion aspect is failing Europe here. The second category is the transactional technologies, or these are the business to consumer platforms that help match the suppliers on one side and the consumers on the other side. And here, you can think of retail, fintech, online stores, online services that are being provided. These are the technologies that have the most potential for closing the income inequality divide in Europe. They can give smaller firms access to really large, much larger markets than what would without the use of platforms. So the report actually finds that the higher use of transactional technologies is actually directly associated with significantly smaller productivity gap between large and small firms. And there is a further good news that actually has to do with fostering job creation. We see that almost 2/3 of European firms that have implemented digital platforms in their businesses have experienced increase in employment growth over the past 3 years. So, this is wonderful because it gives us some evidence to the fear, against the fear that, people will be displaced and jobs will be lost. Yet, the trouble here is that Europe's enterprise leaders in this field are few and far between. It's just not as widespread. Well under half of small and medium-sized businesses in Europe are using digital platforms in day-to-day business. So there is a huge potential here to harness the use of transactional technologies to pursue not only business development and benefits at the firm level, but also, hit positively the goals of the European society. The third group of technologies, this is the cloud-based, the data-driven technologies, which we call informational technologies, actually harnesses advances in computing power and AI, artificial intelligence, to improve how companies are run to provide new and often highly tailored services. These have helped make space and time less relevant. For businesses, they have a far greater benefit for smaller firms than for larger firms, because with lower fixed costs and little to no hardware involved, because you're in the cloud, you're data computing, they have shown to boost productivity in the work phase. So throughout the pandemic, we have seen how these forms of technology can eliminate operational costs as business leaders decide to leave the traditional offices to come and work from home and to migrate to more home-based work models. And this can deliver great benefits to competitiveness as well as to market inclusion. Here in Europe, again, we face a problem. And the problem is that cloud computing and data are also areas where the digital sector in Europe lag significantly behind other regions in the world. So again, the widespread of technologies is not quite there. So, we looked at this framework of the 3 technologies and the 3 European goals, and then we say, okay, so what can be done to address this digital dilemma in Europe and to ensure that more firms can access new digital technologies? And we formulate 3 key recommendations, 3 key suggestions. First, we say building scale in digital markets can help more small firms and firms in rural areas connect. So really go for scale, go for access. Second is shaping data regulations. And here Europe has been a leader in terms of on the regulatory environment, but here shaping data regulations that can balance contestability of the market space and innovation, while at the same time ensuring that there is data privacy and the data privacy is safeguarded while addressing the disproportionate cost this implies for small and young firms is extremely important. The third point, and last in this respect, has to do with smoothing access to new technologies that can expand the range of firms that can access these new opportunities. So here, the question for policymakers is how to help their countries to prepare and to address the digital dilemma so that a dynamic and an inclusive digital economy can be realized that really hits on all 3 of the European goals: market inclusion, competitiveness as well as geographical convergence. So let me stop here.
Thank you very much. This is it's a very important debate also for in connection with the development of cross-border services. Accessibility and also usage of many of the European markets, this one goes to Beata Jaworczyk, and the title of your last report is State Strikes Back, and during many crises, as we saw in Paweł's presentation, this was on CO2, but we saw the many crises we had before. And there were, after these economic crises, we had reevaluation of some economic policies, principles, new policy makers going into government with a different set of tools and different mindsets on how to achieve economic growth, what they think about the inflation, for example, and also what they think the goal of government should be. Do you think this pandemic and a lot of the involvement of the state in the economy, would you many people saw this as the new normal after 2008 and 2009 and the financial crisis, and it didn't happen. I wouldn't say that the state involvement after 2008 very much increased in comparison to the years before. But currently, many say that this is the breaking point. So we're going to see more of the state-driven economies, a new relationship between the free market actors and civil society partners, and also the business community. What's your opinion on that?
Well, thank you, Piotr. So in one respect, the state involvement in the economy has increased after the financial crisis. You clearly see it when you look at state-owned banks. So these banks have expanded very much, both in terms of assets as well as in terms of the number of branches. So in that respect, the state has struck back. Now, what we document in our report is that public perception has become more favorable towards expansion of the role of the state in industry and in firms. So for instance, in post-communist countries, 45% of people believe that state should play a greater role in industry. And that's, if you look at change within cohorts, so you look at people who were adults or young adults when the transformation started, that's an increase on average of 6 percentage points within cohorts. So there's a growing support for state playing a role in the economy. Now, if the history is any guide, this support is going to increase. What we know is that people who reached adulthood during recessions are much more positively predisposed towards redistribution, towards the role of the state in the economy. We see in the data that people who reached adulthood during past epidemics are also have much more positive view of the state. So on the one hand, we have this trend of possible greater expectations and greater public support for increased involvement of the state. Now, on the other hand, we see a lot of private firms that are struggling during the pandemic, that get indebted during the pandemic. And what we know is that during crises, private debts tend to become public debts. So we are likely to see governments injecting equity into firms, so taking partial ownership of firms, or even outright nationalizing firms. And this is going to, in industrialized countries, this is going to lead to debates. Is the taxpayer being fairly compensated for such actions? But in countries with less well-developed institutions with poorer governance, there is a danger that this greater involvement of the state through state-owned enterprises is going to lead to corruption, to nepotism, is going to create vested interest that will make it impossible to privatize these firms later. And there is a real danger that the playing field will be tilted against the private sector. And that's because in many countries, there are no explicit rules that prohibit state-owned enterprises from preferential treatment when it comes to taxes, from obtaining subsidized inputs, land at subsidized prices, from obtaining subsidized credit from state-owned banks. So there is a real danger that they will be favored in the economy. And we know that state-owned enterprises tend to be less efficient, they tend to be less innovative. So this greater presence of them in the economy may have impact on long-term growth. Then there's the issue of state-owned banks. In our report, we document both the positives and the negatives brought about by state-owned banks. So on the positive side, they tend to have a greater risk appetite. And they were bringing credit to the economy during the financial crisis, which was the time when private banks were retreating. We see that they have a greater risk appetite. They are much more willing to give loans to young firms, to firms that are unable to post collateral. But there is also the dark side. State-owned banks can be used for political purposes. We see it, for instance, very clearly on the example of Turkey, where we look at the report at provinces where local elections are closely contested. And we see that in provinces where the local mayor is aligned with the ruling party, state-owned banks were pumping credit. At the same time, they were withdrawing credit from provinces which were ruled by the opposition party. And this misuse of state-owned banks for political purposes is not just limited to Turkey. It has been observed in Russia, in Brazil, and there is also evidence that Landesbanken in Germany are subject to electoral cycles. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's truly interesting about Landesbanks, I'm going to go more into that. Reading your report. Oh, and I see a lot of questions actually. So I'm going to go to the Q&A. The first one is from Marcin Gocłowski from Reuters. As well as to Beata Jaworczyk or for Galina Miselet, if Poland and Hungary are successful in delaying the launch of the multi-annual financial framework, what would be the consequences for the economies in 2021? In particular, EBRD expects Poland GDP to rise by 3% next year. What would be the forecast in taking into account the delay, any impact at all? And which one of you two wants to answer?
Well, I'm happy to start. So in 2019, in Poland, investment to GDP ratio, which was at 18.6%, was one of the lowest. Actually, it was the lowest in Central Europe and the Baltic states. And investment to GDP fell further in the first half of this year. So certainly anything that will have an adverse impact on investment, it's going to be detrimental to growth. When it comes to specific forecasts for 2021, I do not believe that we were expecting massive inflows from the EU Rescue Fund, simply because we know that it takes time to obtain access to those funds and to implement the projects.
Okay, Galina.
I would just add very briefly, I'm happy also to follow up with the journalist bilaterally. We are updating currently our forecasts, and we'll be coming out with detailed forecasts for each of our program countries. But I think what is important here is that we frame the recovery in properly, right? Here, what is extremely important is that as we reboot, if you will, as we start the economic rebound, it is extremely important that investment is concentrated in people. And here, health, education, delivery of public services is of extreme importance, as well as investment is concentrated in green as well as digital. And we spoke a little bit about digital. We didn't speak about green. Maybe we can pick that question later in the discussion. But the type of investment, there's quite a lot of resources available, and making these resources invested well and utilized well will be really the key to the recovery of any country in Europe, any country in the world, given the massive size of the economic recovery packages. So let's make sure that we put this into perspective and make sure that we have our eye on the ball with the goal of investing well for good returns. Thank you.
Thank you. I have this question concerning green growth, but still I just see 5 or 6 questions from the people. I always see that the questions from the audience are more interesting. And I'm going to pack 2 of them together because they're on the same, no, I'm going to pack those 2 later on. This is from Tomasz Mal. Should deregulation be the EU answer to post-pandemic era? If so, in what areas? Maybe some time to think about it and then an answer, or?
Well, it's an interesting question. Should deregulation be an answer? I actually think that in the post-pandemic era, we may see more regulation rather than deregulation. And that's for 2 reasons. So first of all, the pandemic has exposed the weakness of the so-called zero-hour contracts, gig economy. What we have also seen over the past decades is pushing of risk away from employers, from firms, and onto workers. And during the pandemic, something we talk about in our regional economic prospects report is that people with less education, people in lower income brackets, people who are least able to take risks and people who are least willing to take risks have been hit harder by the economic crisis caused by COVID. So I think what we are going to see in Europe is perhaps a discussion about some renegotiation of the social contract. So I actually would think that the public support may swing towards actually forcing firms to offer more protection and more risk mitigation, and that that can be achieved through labor market regulations. So that's one area. The other area is, the green economy. We've been talking for 2 decades about corporate social responsibility, about ESG rules, and these rules have clearly not delivered, right? The firms have clearly not made enough progress on the green front. And, clearly action is needed if we are going to achieve carbon neutrality. So I actually would expect more regulation rather than less.
Piotr, I'll add very briefly to Beata's two-pronged answer that she gave us. And I would actually flip the question a little bit around. It's not about deregulation or re-regulation, overregulation. I think it's about the quality of regulation. It's about the quality of institution. And we have seen that, when the quality of institutions is high, the ability of economies to respond to shock is also high. So there is a direct association between those. And I think this is where we really need to focus, and we need to link building resilience, building sustainability with enforcing the institutions and the foundations of governance of the economy. So here, boosting resilience requires a policy mix, if I may describe it in this way, that reduces income inequality, that protects low incomes, that creates flexibility in the labor markets. Beata mentioned that supports the private sector competitiveness and competition, but also that encourages and strengthens trust in institutions to deliver, to protect, and to protect its contracts, its rights, and its citizens. So to me, really, it is about the quality of institutions rather than regulation went up or regulation went down. Let me stop here.
Thank you. There's also a question, and I think it's going to be to Galina. This is a question I'm going to some bit answer it. So how deep is the upcoming crisis? How deep the upcoming crisis will be? Are there any estimations? And I know that the World Bank publishes the global estimates for the recession. So we started. We're in a crisis. It's not not that it's going to start next year. So hopefully we're going to leave it anytime soon. And I don't know what are the estimates of the GDP? What's your forecast for 2020 and for 2021?
So, I spoke a little bit in the beginning, but let me give you again a little bit of highlight of the numbers. We expect that the global economy will contract in 2020 by over 5%. Our latest forecast is 5.2%. This is the global economy. We do expect a rebound or a recovery in 2021. It will be slower, and we will not be able to achieve the level of 2019 in just 1 year. We expect that different countries may take 2 to 3 years to get to their pre-COVID-19 GDP levels, or those are the levels of 2019. For Europe, again, I will repeat, our forecast is in the magnitude between 1.1 and 3.3, if I have to be super specific. Again, it's a very large range. We do have also many countries, but the range is large because of the unprecedented uncertainty that we see, which is associated with the really quite large downside risks to the outlook. Beata also spoke about this uncertainty, so I think we have consensus about how shaky, if you will, the recovery may or may not be. We are, of course, hoping for a stronger recovery, but again, we do not expect to reach the levels of pre-crisis of 2019 in just 1 year. It's going to take longer.
If I may chip in here, the irony of the current crisis is that it's much easier to talk about what will happen in 5 years than about next year. And the difficulty with making forecasts is twofold. First, we do not know how the disease will progress, how the governments will respond in terms of lockdowns and how soon vaccine will be able to reach vast parts of the population. That's one source of uncertainty. The other source of uncertainty is early estimates of what has already happened, right? So our predictions for rebound next year depend on how well we can measure what has happened in this year so far. And if you look at the data from the global financial crisis, what you see is that the early forecasts were very wrong. So if you look, for instance, at forecasts for the last quarter of 2018, forecasts that were made in the middle of that quarter. And if you look at early estimates of what actually had happened, and the range of the final figures to estimate and to forecast is between minus 400% and plus 400%. And it's not sometimes even the direction of change was wrong. So it's just extremely difficult to talk about what will happen. It's more helpful to talk about channels through which countries may be affected both externally and internally.
Okay, and there's another question which is, I think, to you, Beata. It's about, can we say that the globalization era is coming to an end? You actually talked about this before, but there is a second one from Marcin Kędzierski from Jagielloński Club. In the recent years, EU has been being marginalized at the global stage. The process was clearly described even in the official EC documents, but the current US-China tension and the global impact of COVID might change the situation. Do you see an opportunity to build a global position of EU, bearing in mind the potential deglobalization, regionalization of globalization? So there are two questions connected with globalizations and also opportunity for Europe.
So I don't think we are going to see deglobalization. So far we haven't seen big resurgence in protectionism. My hope is that the new US administration is going to be more supportive of free trade. So I am more optimistic. I don't think we will see deglobalization. Now, in terms of European role, I think Europe can continue to serve as a champion of global free trade and as a champion of climate change mitigation efforts. But of course, the EU cannot achieve that alone, right? So, as you clearly pointed out in your report, there is a need to strengthen the World Trade Organization, which has been very much weakened by the fact that the US-China trade war is being fought outside of the WTO. The appellate body in the WTO, which provides a mechanism for resolving disputes between countries, stopped functioning because the US has blocked nominations of judges. So the hope is that the EU will be able to bring the US back to the WTO table and reinvigorate the organization. And I think a similar hope is associated with US coming back to the Paris Agreement and supporting climate goals. Now, what the EU can do is, if we are serious about achieving carbon neutrality, obviously carbon prices within the European Union will have to go up. There will be a need to prevent carbon leakage. So that means carbon adjustment tax that will need to be collected at the border. And imposition of such tax can encourage other countries to follow suit, because instead of paying this tax to the European coffers, right, they can simply tax carbon at home and keep the proceeds. So in this way, EU can become climate leader.
Okay, thank you. And there's one last question, and I think I'm gonna ask it to Galina. What further integration measures are necessary to post-pandemic on EU level to cover the blind spots COVID-19 uncovered? You talk about this somehow in your paper and we discussed about poverty, a health union, better integrated social security. Unclear what applies to from HBW from other EU countries. What else? What could be the reason to cooperate?
So, Piotr, this is this question brings a dimension that we haven't quite explicitly discussed, and this is the dimension of human capital. And I think this is probably the way I would approach this. And we see that the COVID-19 pandemic has hit human capital directly in Europe, both affecting education as well as health. So, you know, we have estimates where we show that school closures may lead to learning losses equivalent from between a third to a full year of schooling, especially if this second wave of school closures lasts longer. And here, you know, the school closures, for example, are likely to exacerbate inequalities by disproportionately affecting students from disadvantaged background. And, you know, I'm even putting aside how the human toll that the disease has itself in terms of thousands of people already lost their lives from the pandemic. So here, you know, the effort, and I very much would believe that this is an effort at the individual country level, but also at the European level, at the level of international partners such as the World Bank, will be really about investing in people. And I've said this already in earlier remarks, but it's extremely important because, you know, the European societies, you yourself in the report you presented to us today, the European societies are facing a demographic pressure, right? There is aging, which is underway, and the COVID is only exacerbating this process. But if you look at the region a little bit from a broader global perspective, the countries actually provide relatively good basic education and health services. The region's citizens, you know, begin their lives in a much better position than their peers in other regions of the world. However, the job market now demands different things. The job market demands higher level of human capital than in the past. So here, basic education is not going to cut it, right? It's not going to be enough. So here, investing in higher education institutions that prepare students and workers that can, you know, address the challenges of the future of work may hold will be very important. And this links with the point on competitiveness as well. If Europe is to maintain its competitive position globally, I mean, we spoke about, you know, the operational technologies where Europe is a global leader. You know, the continent needs to anchor its unique value proposition in innovation. It has to invest in digital skills. It has to invest in new skills. And similarly, you know, we can make the same argument on the health front. So adults need to remain healthy and active despite the fact that they're aging. They have to you know, continue learning and acquiring skills throughout their lives, not just in the initial years. So here, reducing the risks of obesity, of smoking, of drinking are very important for active and productive aging. So again, I would circle this and say, you know, modernizing the foundations of education systems, especially access and quality of tertiary education. It's extremely important, but also reducing some of the health factors will be, will be two forces that will directly, positively impact human capital. And this is, this is an area where action is needed at every level, at the country level, at the European level, but also, with support of partners and organizations such as the World Bank. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know if Beata, do you want to chip in? Because it's probably we're going to finish just in a few minutes. So
sure, if I can just chip in. So in the report, you touch upon demographic trends. So to link it back to what Galina was saying about health outcomes, if you look at new EU member states and you ask people how healthy they are, you see that among young people, among people up to roughly age of 40, there is no difference between Eastern Europe and the West, right, or G7 countries. Self-reported health outcomes are very similar. Now, what makes new EU member state different is this sudden deterioration in self-reported health outcomes starting at the age of 50. And then this gap increases, the older the respondent is. And this is one reason why older part of the population may be less economically active and why they may be less interested in continuing working. The second thing that you see is ICT skills. So while young people in, for instance, new EU member states have comparable ICT skills to their peers in Western Europe or G7 countries, there is a huge gap when it comes to IT skills for people who are 50 and older. So if one way of dealing with the demographic crisis is to energize older workers and to encourage them to continue working longer, but that requires interventions on the health front. So availability of healthcare, public health campaigns, so basically promoting healthy lifestyle, and skills.
Okay, thank you very much. And we didn't touch upon one issue that I also wanted to discuss, but I as you saw, there are many questions from the people watching. So that's good, because somebody was interested in what we were talking about in our part of the, someone's going in. So I think it's the postman. I think we're gonna end here. We didn't touch upon the issue of climate change, and I think that this is also a discussion we're gonna have in a month from now with the final meeting of the European leaders, and also of some kind of agreement between member states on reaching climate neutrality. And this is also a very important risk if we're gonna go to climate neutrality, because after a pandemic, then what else could happen? Maybe some crucial climate changes that are gonna influence the state of the whole world. You never know. So thank you, Beata, for being here. Thank you, Galina. Thank you to everybody who was watching and asking also those different sorts of questions. Read the report, read the new World Bank's reports, read the EBRD report on the state interventionism after 2008 and after the pandemic. Thank you, Paweł, for the presentation. Thank you, Minister Kurtyka, for being with us, although in a different place. And also, thank you to everybody who tuned in. Thanks, and we'll meet soon, hopefully in person.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.